I rise, and I know my distinguished colleague from Colorado, Senator Bennett, wants to speak to this issue as well, and he has been a champion along with me and several others to try to bring justice to an issue that I think is incredibly important. Madam President, it's no secret that decades of indifference and discrimination in lending practices at the United States Department of Agriculture have made it difficult for minority farmers, specifically Hispanic farmers, to make a living at what they love to do and have done in many cases for generations, leaving many no choice but to leave the farms and ranches they have tended to all of their lives. In the year 2000, 110 Hispanic farmers brought a lawsuit against the United States Department of Agriculture for the same egregious discriminatory practices that resulted in a historic settlement with African American farmers. And for 8 long years, under the last administration, thousands of Hispanic farmers who joined the suit waited and waited and waited for justice. And some of them died waiting and will never be made whole. And for 8 long years, the Bush administration did nothing. These hard-working farmers, Hispanic families who bought a piece of land, built a family farm, their small piece of the American dream, were wrongly denied loans and other benefits in violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act by county committees that review Farm Service Administration credit and loan applications for approval. Consequently, these farmers filed suit in the hope that it would change the discriminatory practices at the USDA, how it treated America's minority farmers, but under the Bush administration, nothing changed. The discrimination continued. Then something did change. We got a new president and a new Secretary of Agriculture who described past practices at the United States Department of Agriculture as, quote, a conspiracy to force minority and socially disadvantaged farmers off of their land. Now, consequently, the administration committed to appropriate $1.25 billion in the fiscal 2010 budget to settle some of the outstanding discrimination lawsuits, but not all of them. To date, Hispanic farmers, women, and Native Americans have not yet seen a settlement. Madam President, we need to remedy this situation once and for all, and the new United States Department of Agriculture Secretary needs to make these farmers whole. Secretary Vilsack has created a task force to review the department's civil rights complaints and announce new efforts for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to end any and all discriminatory practices, and I commend the Secretary for addressing this lingering issue. But more needs to be done. As I said, along with 7 of my Senate colleagues in a letter to the President, quoting from that letter, we said, the United States Department of Agriculture's corrective role in this instance has been clearly laid out, and there remains no legitimate reason to delay action for any of the affected groups. The fact is, 8 years after a do-nothing Republican administration that earned the United States Department of Agriculture the designation of, quote, the last plantation, putting people's lives and livelihoods at risk, we simply cannot wait any longer. Certainly, for example, Alfonso and Vera Chavez cannot wait any longer. The Fresno Bee reported last week that Mr. and Mrs. Chavez stopped farming 7 years ago when they could not get a USDA loan. In fact, they said they not only could not get the loan, but they were discouraged from applying. And even worse, they believe they were given misinformation so that they would not apply. To quote Vera Chavez, who told the reporter, it was like they didn't want us to have the money. Mr. and Mrs. Chavez owned 300 acres. They sold off 200 of those acres, shut down their packing house, and leased the remaining 100 acres to survive. Vera said, and I quote, it's why we've been hanging on to those 100 acres, so my children and grandchildren can have a little piece of land we worked so hard to get. I'm not going to give up. But we've written so many letters, had so many meetings, and nothing seems to be moving forward. Madam President, we need to move this forward. It's about fairness. It's about doing what is right. When we see discrimination in any form, when those who have been wronged because of their race, their gender, or heritage are forced to sell what they have worked a lifetime to build, abandoned by the last administration that cared more about Wall Street than Main Street, we have to make things right for them, for people like Vera and Alfonso Chavez. We need to make sure that they can keep their farms and give them back their lives. Madam President, all these farmers are asking for is a common sense solution sooner rather than later, because they've waited long enough. And you know, I just received a letter that is addressed to the President, and it is a letter from the named plaintiff in the landmark case Pigford versus Glickman. That was the case that brought together African-American farmers in that landmark decision who were also discriminated against. And the letter to the President by Mr. Pigford says, quote, referring to Hispanic, Native American, and women farmers, quote, it says, they have suffered the same discrimination by the United States Department of Agriculture as African-American farmers. Just as USDA addressed the claims of African Americans on a class-wide basis, it should similarly settle the discrimination claims of Hispanic and other minority farmers on a class-wide basis. Furthermore, to continue to quote from his letter, it makes no sense for 4 minority groups to suffer the identical discrimination from the same federal agency, and yet only one of those 4 groups to be compensated on a class-wide basis. The letter goes on to say, Mr. President, fundamental fairness and simple practice demand that you close the entire book on all discrimination at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and consistent with Section 104011, resolve all pending claims and class actions in an expeditious and just manner. Madam President, I want to ask unanimous consent to include Mr. Pickford's entire letter to the President in the record.
Without objection.
So we urge Secretary Vilsack to ensure all farmers will be granted the same consideration so they can begin to rebuild their lives and their farms this year. Despite clear language in Section 1411 of the Food Conservation and Energy Act of 2008, which urges the administration to settle lawsuits brought by Hispanic and other farmers, the administration clearly needs to assure Hispanic farmers, many who have come to me and to Senator Bennett and others to ask for help, that it fully intends to address these cases consistent with Section 14011 of the 2008 Farm Bill. We simply cannot continue down this winding road to nowhere. To ignore the plight of the thousands of Hispanic farmers, families who seek nothing more than justice, who want only a chance to keep the farms and ranches they work so hard for all of their lives, is just wrong. Madam President, for 8 years, thousands of families like the Chavezes were ignored. Now we need to change that. We need to move quickly to resolve what is clearly and patently unfair and unjust. We will never turn the page on the past discriminatory practices within the USDA until all victims, every last one of them, is made whole for the loss of their land, their dignity, their hope for a decent life for themselves and their families. Let us move quickly to give them the chance they have waited for, the chance to rebuild their lives. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.